I'm the Policy and Programs Manager at the Tourism Industry Council of South Australia. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of First Nations people and their ongoing culture and connection to the land and waters of South Australia. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands where you all join us from today and the First Nations people participating in this webinar. I would also like to acknowledge that we aim to make this space an inclusive environment, and we'd like to acknowledge the people in our community who have advocated for everyone's right to belong and bring attention to the ways we can do this. For us at TiCSA, accessibility and inclusion are important. So our In Conversation series, hopefully many of you have joined us before, but these short webinars are part of our business development support that we provide to tourism operators like yourselves with insights and advice that can help you with your business planning and operations. While I'll be asking a number of questions of our guests today, these sessions are very much open to you. So please do pop some questions in the chat along the way as they come to mind, and we'll throw them to our guests. But in those moments, please do keep your microphone on mute. And if we need a bit of clarity or want to dig into a question a bit deeper, I'll ask you to take your microphone off mute. And just for everyone's information, this session is being recorded and it will be distributed to registered attendees and TiCSA members afterwards. So let's dive straight in. Today's In Conversation, we're chatting with Andrew Fisher from our valued corporate partner, Wallmans Lawyers, and Charmaine Fulton from St John's Ambulance SA. I keep going to put the SA at the front for some reason today. But we're here to talk about the new legislation that's going to require many tourism businesses to have publicly accessible defibrillators from January 2026. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Wallmans Lawyers, they're a full-service commercial law firm with key specialisation in the tourism industry. Wallmans provide a one-stop shop assisting tourism operators with commercial and business law, acquisition, sales, property and leasing, hospitality and licensing, employment and industrial relations and disputes. Andrew will give a little bit more about himself, but he specialises in property and commercial law. And as a skilled commercial lawyer, he regularly assists clients with related commercial matters such as supplier contracts, asset protection strategies, trusts and agency agreements. We're also joined, as I said, by Charmaine Fulton from St John Ambulance SA to talk to us about how they can support you guys as operators with meeting these legislation requirements. We did have an In Conversation with Charmaine earlier this year. And this topic we dived into a fair bit. And so this is, I guess, that next step and getting some legal perspectives on what is this legislation saying and what does it mean for you guys as operators. So really pleased to have both Andrew and Charmaine joining us today. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. So Andrew, to kick things off, do you just want to give us a quick rundown of your role as a property lawyer, including when and why a tourism business might need your services? And I guess to this effect, why legislation like this defibrillator legislation falls into your area of expertise?
Yeah, thank you, Christina. So my area of practice is commercial and property law. So I do a lot of work with general contracts that businesses enter into, particularly regarding property, so commercial leases, business sale agreements, land sale agreements, partnership agreements, etc. So with the defib legislation, one of the key questions is who is going to be responsible for compliance, and another question that no doubt people will be concerned about is whoever has to comply with the legislation, can they pass the cost of compliance through to anybody else? So that's I guess why this act falls within the area of property law. I should say that Charmaine, you should feel free to jump in if I've been looking at this from a legal perspective, obviously. So I've read the Act and various other materials, but I wouldn't know how to use a defib or, which end needs to go where. So from a practical perspective, Charmaine, please feel free to jump in.
Certainly.
Absolutely. And that's the idea of having both of you with us today, is to give those two different perspectives.
Yes.
Charmaine, did you just want to quickly touch on St John's Ambulance broadly and what you guys do, and then we'll dive into the questions about the defib legislation more specifically.
Okay, so St John's obviously been around for many years. We service the community in different areas. You'll see us at events, our staff walking around. We have volunteers and we have paid staff as well. Everything from community care, and that can be taking elderly people to their hospital appointments or medical appointments, through to concerts and so forth. And obviously we have our lotto every year, and we also, my role is to help businesses achieve their obligations with first aid requirements in their workforce.
Thanks, Charmaine. So let's jump into the discussion about this new defibrillator legislation. Andrew, are you able to give us a rundown of what the legislation is, what types of businesses are going to be required to comply with it, and when?
Yeah, certainly. So the purpose of the legislation is to get defibs into, I'm sorry about using the abbreviation defibs, but
that's all right. I'll use it too now because I'm getting tongue-tied.
I just find the full word doesn't roll off the tongue too well, at least not in my case. So
absolutely.
But the purpose is to get them into public spaces, and more particularly into public buildings, public facilities, and vehicles that are used by the public. So the key distinction, I suppose, there is that so defibs are already governed to a degree by the work health and safety regime, which regulates workplaces. There's no, as I understand it, no mandatory WHS requirement to have defibs, but that's the WHS is not really my area. But what the legislation is seeking to do is to regulate spaces in buildings and also vehicles that are not covered by WHS. So it's a particular regime for those areas that are not deemed to be workplaces. That said, there is a little bit of crossover because the Defib Act does talk about some training requirements that WHS first aid people need to do. And there'll be, maybe it's already included in that training, but if it's not, there'll be a defib sort of aspect to that first aid training.
I'll interrupt there. So CPR, and which has defibrillation in it, needs to be renewed from first aiders annually, and first aid is every 3 years.
Yeah. Thank you. So the Act is now, from a legal perspective, the Act is now law. It's binding. So it's gone through both houses of Parliament and it's now an Act, but it hasn't actually commenced yet. And I'll get to the commencement date soon. But despite the fact that it hasn't commenced yet, there's already a whole bunch of amendments that are proposed, which is all available on the SA Health website. So on that website, there's information about the amendments. There's also a link to the amendments, as well as a link to public submissions. So if anybody's fired up about this, then they can have a say. Public submissions close on the 30th of June. So that's all through the SA Health website. It is pretty unusual to have an Act that hasn't even commenced yet, to have amendments already proposed, and they're quite extensive amendments. So I guess the discussion today needs to just be, people need to bear in mind that the details are sort of as at what we know today, but they are subject to change. Change not just because of these amendments that are proposed, but also because there are regulations that haven't been introduced or even released yet that will be filling in a lot of the detail here. So the way ACT works often is that there's the legislation which sets out the primary responsibilities, and then there's the regulations which usually come in later and sort of fill in the detail and provide more about the rules in terms of compliance. So we haven't even seen those regulations yet. I don't know if anyone here has actually gone to, no doubt, Charmaine, you've gone to the legislation and had a read of it. I must admit that I'm not surprised that it's being amended. It's quite difficult to understand, I believe. I had to read it a number of times in order to try and get my head around it. I think
That's really relieving to know, Andrew, that a lawyer had found it difficult to understand. So that gives us some solace, you know, as businesses.
Lines over and over, and you're still kind of like, what? That doesn't make sense. And you know, public access, but you can have it in a building, and there's a lot of confusion. So I'm not surprised there's been a lot of amendments.
I think if you have a look through the SA Health website at the amendments, most of the amendments are directed at the definitions. And I think that's the real problem with the way this Act has been drafted. The definitions seem to me to be really convoluted. I just feel as though it could have been a lot simpler, but unfortunately, it is what it is, and we've just got to try and unpick it.
Yeah. So I guess that being said, at this point, taking into account that it might shift, who is required or who is going to be captured by this legislation as it currently stands?
Yep. Well, I'm sure this won't change. I guess from a legal perspective, the burden of compliance or the responsibility to comply rests with the owners. So we're talking here about buildings, facilities, and vehicles, and we can get down into the definitions and detail of that. But in essence, it's the obligation of the owners to comply with the requirement to have one or more defibs in place. So, you know, business owners, tenants, maybe companies that might hire vehicles but not own the vehicles, they don't have a responsibility to comply with the legislation. But what they will need to probably look at in due course is what their lease or hire agreement or license arrangement says about what they need to pay for, because it might be the case that the owners, even though the owners have to comply with the legislation, they might be able to pass the cost of compliance through to the classic example is a tenancy. So under the lease, the landlord might be able to pass the cost of compliance onto the tenant.
Yeah, right.
So, but it's the owners who are potentially liable for penalties if they don't comply. So the maximum fine for not complying is $20,000, and it'll be the owners who suffer that penalty if their buildings or facilities or vehicles don't comply.
Okay. So just for my clarity, it's the owners of the building or the vehicle that are required to comply, but the business owner, if they're leasing or they're not the owner of the building at this point, they're not required to.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
They're not required to, but it does require people to have a look at the terms of their written agreement.
Yeah.
For two reasons, actually. Yeah, I said earlier that the lease, I'll use the example of a lease again. The lease might require the tenant to reimburse the landlord for the cost of putting in a defib.
Yeah, right. As
part of the building outgoings, and the same principle applies to a hire agreement for a vehicle. Attention should also be given to whether the agreements actually say that the tenant needs to comply with all laws. Often leases will have a clause like that, and it is possible that a clause like that a landlord could say to a tenant, well, you've got to put in the defib yourself because you've got this clause that says you've got to comply with all laws.
Yeah, right.
So that's a possibility. So people do
Mm.
need to have a look at their agreements, but really the fundamental responsibility is on owners. So it's up to
Supporting owners,
owners to determine whether they're captured by the Act, and if so, where the defibs need to go and that sort of thing.
Right. And I guess, so broadly speaking, what are businesses required to do? So obviously there's a square meterage rule.
Yeah, there
around.
is. So I might just firstly, if I could just, before I get to that, mention the timeframes here, because
Yes.
I think, as I said, there are amendments proposed and there are regulations that we haven't seen yet. So the timeframe's important because non-government buildings and facilities and vehicles don't need to comply with this until the 1st of January 2026.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the rest of this year and all of next year to understand in more detail what all of the requirements are. So if anyone is leasing property from the state government, then the commencement date is 1 January 2025. I imagine that's quite a small number of people, but because basically the legislation applies to government from 1 January 2025 and everybody else 1 January 2026. So it might be the case that when we have more clarity about these issues, perhaps at some stage next year, Wallmans and
Touch base again.
TiCSA
Yeah, that would be
might.
amazing. And is that state government buildings, or does that cover
State government.
local government as
No,
well?
not local government, just state government. Yeah.
Great. Because
Yeah.
particularly out in regions, often tourism operators do use local government buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm aware of a number of caravan parks, for example, where the councils own the land and lease it to the operator. 2026, January 2026 is the date for them. Yeah, so in terms of compliance, and as you said, Christina, there's a square meterage rule. So in terms of, I'll talk about buildings and facilities first, and then talk about vehicles afterwards. So owners need to put in one defib if their building is what's called and this is the defined term in the Act, a designated building or facility. And a designated building or facility is, well, the definition of that gives a whole list of examples, and then it's got like a general catch-all. So firstly, I'll give you some of the examples of what a designated building or facility is. It's a retirement village, and for good reason, they should have defibs. I would assume many would
I'd agree with that, yep.
Caravan parks, venues with gambling, which is interesting. So that brings in hotels with gaming machines,
yeah.
I would have thought. And just for clarity, gambling excludes the sale of lottery tickets. So
not your local news agency.
Yeah, so news agents are not brought in through that concept. It also includes theatres, swimming pools, and there are a few other specific examples that the Act gives that I don't think are relevant here. And then there's this catch-all, which is buildings or facilities to which the public has access. Now, the definition of public access includes payment of money in order to access. So zoos, for example, anywhere else where you need to actually buy a ticket, for example, to get in, still considered to be public access buildings. So So in essence, there's that catch-all. So any building or facility to which the public has access. So those facilities and buildings need to have one defib. The square meterage rule comes in because, and it's interesting that this is only, as the Act stands at the moment, there's no square meterage rule. It's just any building or facility. I think that was one of the mistakes that they made when they drafted the legislation originally, and that's what the amendments are seeking to address. So there's a specific definition of building. You won't be surprised to hear that the first aspect of that definition is that it's a structure with roof and walls. So thank you. But it's also a structure with a floor area of 600 square meters or more. So if it's less than 600 square meters, it's technically not a quote unquote building for the purposes of the Act. No defib required. You might have noticed that I've been using the phrase facility as well. So the Act talks about buildings or facilities. Again, the Act doesn't define, the Act as it stands at the moment doesn't have a definition of facility, but the amendments provide a definition. And I think before I give you a summary of the definition, I think what they've got in mind here are things like stadiums, things that are that are kind of open on. They might not have walls, for example. They might have a roof but not walls, and so ordinarily you might not think of them as a building. So what a facility is, it's defined as enclosed structures, and that's enclosed partially or fully, with a floor area of 600 square meters or more, and used for sporting or recreational activities attended by the public. So sporting or recreational. So that could capture, I think, camping grounds. Like I said, caravan parks are included anyway, but that you might have a camping ground with a communal kitchen that could be captured by that. And then there are other aspects to the definition of facility that I don't think we need to drill down into.
Mm.
So that's where the square meter rule comes in. And in essence, what it all boils down to is that if you've got a building or a facility with 600 square meters of floor area and the public has access to that building or facility, then you've got to put in one defib.
And so just thinking through the different types of businesses, because previously we've talked about hotels and motels, would accommodation, when you describe the payment of tickets, and we talked, that was more, your zoos and your museums and whatnot, paying for a room at a hotel or going to eat at a restaurant in a hotel or accommodation. Do you think that fits within that definition?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it does. It does.
So it's not just tickets, it's, I guess, from a tourism perspective, it's the fact that your customers are paying for your tourism product. And if you've got a building over 600 square meters.
Yeah. So the Act talks about even if you're paying for access, it's considered to be publicly accessible. Accommodation businesses definitely captured.
Yeah. Okay.
Andrew, can I just ask you, is it considered every 600 meters there or 1200 meters? I was a bit confused with the square meterage as to whether they had to have a defib every 1200 square meters or.
I don't blame you, Charmaine, for being confused because I had to read all of this several times in order to arrive at the point where I feel like I understand it, to be honest. So the answer to that is that you've only got to put in one unless unless you fall within what the Act calls I'll give you the definition, don't worry about it too much, but if you are a relevant designated business or facility or prescribed building, what that boils down to is if your building meets the prior definition that we talked about before, and in addition to that, if the building is used for commercial purposes and has publicly accessible floor area of more than 1,200 square meters, then you've got to put in 1 defib for every 1,200.
Yeah.
So
We've got hotels that we've consulted with, and they're probably looking at having to have one on every floor from what we gather from the bill. So I just wanted to clarify that with you.
I think hotels will probably fall within that category. They're obviously used for commercial purposes. And yeah, many of them would have publicly accessible floor area of more than 1,200. Publicly accessible floor area is defined. To be honest, I'd have to think about whether that when you measure that, does that include private accommodation rooms upstairs in a hotel? Or is it just the bar, gaming, stairs, or toilets, all of that sort of thing?
I think because it was accommodation, we were under the impression that it would be pretty much every floor type of thing if that floor space, including the rooms, was 1,200 square meters. But because technically people are coming in and out of those rooms that are from the public. So it's a tricky one.
Well, the Act just talks about space that's open to the public. And it talks about areas that the public has unobstructed access to. As I say, it does, and open to the public can include spaces that you have to pay in order to access. So yeah, I think probably on the face of it, it probably does include all of the accommodation rooms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But perhaps it's best to wait until these amendments come through, do you think, Andrew?
Yeah,
before-
definitely. Yeah, that'll be the first
Given the
thing.
lead time as well, it's
Because you're absolutely right, because the definition of publicly accessible floor area is part of the amendments. It doesn't actually exist yet in the Act. And I expect that the regulations will probably provide a bit more clarity too about how to measure the floor area. So
let's not make too many assumptions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is dangerous to do that. So that'll be something to consider in due course.
Okay, great. I guess just, we've talked a bit about buildings and there's certainly some uncertainty there, but what about vehicles? So buses, boats and so forth. They're a rather large part of our tourism industry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk about buses first. So the Act talks about quote unquote public buses. And the relevance is that if you have a public bus, then a defib needs to be installed. There are two aspects.
Regardless of the size of the bus?
No, I was going to say, sorry, there are two aspects to the definition of what is a public bus. One of them relates to size. So if it carries or is capable of carrying 15 or more adults, including the driver, then it meets that part of the definition. If it's smaller than that, it's not a public bus and it doesn't need a defib. The second part of the definition is that the bus needs to be, quote, engaged in regular passenger services under the Passenger Transport Act. So I must admit I hadn't before looking at all of this hadn't really been familiar with the Passenger Transport Act. So I've now had to have a look at that. And that act has a definition of regular passenger services, and it talks about the main elements are if you're conducting a transport service, so which I would assume most buses are, and you are undertaking regular routes and timetables. So that's an interesting one. If what you have is just a charter bus where groups of people hire you and tell you where they want to go, and you're not dictating timetables and regular routes, I don't think what you have is a public bus under this definition. I see someone's asked a question about aircraft, and I'll come to that shortly. So yeah, if you have a bus that is governed by the Passenger Transport Act because you're running regular routes and timetables and you're over that 15 plus size, then you're captured, you're a public bus, and you've got to put in a defib. I think many people will probably, I would assume they would be aware of whether they're captured by the Passenger Transport Act or not. I'm not overly familiar with that system, but I think there's an accreditation type system that people need to comply with under that act. They've got to get their buses accredited and maybe the drivers accredited as well.
I don't have my head around it. I know commercial tour operators have licensing requirements, whether it's
through Department of Infrastructure and Transport.
Again, I don't want to make assumptions that that's the act that requirement sits under. That would be interesting to find out.
Yeah. So that's public buses. If you're not a public bus, you're not captured by the defib requirements. In terms of other vehicles, there's unfortunately not a whole lot of clarity at the moment, other than if you happen to operate a train, then you definitely need a defib, and there's no size specifications or anything. Similarly with a tram, so trains and trams are just automatically in, as well as any other vehicle prescribed by the regulations. And vehicle is defined to include aircrafts and boats. So I think you can assume that planes and boats are going to be included. Sorry, I should rephrase that. Some planes and some boats are going to be included, but we have to wait for the regulations to see which ones. I assume it's just going to depend on passenger capacity in a similar manner to the public bus concept, whether they choose the same size or not, whether it's going to be still 15 or more, including the driver. Obviously, we don't know, but that'll be one thing that the regulations are going to clarify.
Okay. Clear as mud, Andrew. Clear as mud. Thank you.
That's all right.
It's good to step through it, I guess, even though there's a lot of unknowns, just where we're at this point, like you said. And, for everyone tuning in today or listening to the recording, we will certainly circle back to this later in the year or early next year as the knowns become certain. We can look at it in more detail.
I think if anybody, for whatever reason, believes that, for example, boats or planes should have some type of specific exclusion, then feel free to jump onto the SA Health website and put your 5 cents in through the public submissions that have been called for on the amendments.
Absolutely. I've popped that link in the chat, and we'll put it in the email that goes out afterwards as well.
Yeah, I don't think your comments need to be limited just to the amendments that are proposed, because there is already a bill with the amendments, the proposed amendments, as well as an explanatory paper. But you can make submissions about anything else in the Act or in relation to the Act that you think needs to be clarified or
consideration. Absolutely. Is it clear to you, Andrew, in the legislation where that AED needs to be situated? Is it inside the building, outside the building?
Yeah.
And I guess those questions came from some of our members because, you know, they have open and closing time. So if it's in the
Yep.
building and they're closed, does it still need to be publicly accessible?
Yeah. The short answer is that the Act, all the Act has to say about that is that the defib needs to go in the building or facility. I would assume that that means inside. I don't think that, well, there's certainly no obligation to make the defib accessible 24/7.
Okay.
That's right. Also, there will be a register where your defib, you register on there and you just put what hours it's accessible.
Yeah.
So there's an app called Good Sam app. It'll be similar to that, I assume, and you can look up, even today, you can look up where your nearest defib is. And so if people register on there, they just need to put in the hours that it's accessible.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And I think that's consistent with what, you know, the Act is trying to make defibs publicly available within buildings and facilities. It's not the job of building owners or anybody else to install defibs outside the building where they're going to be accessible 24/7 and also potentially liable to being damaged by.
Well, that was, one of the other concerns that kept getting raised is that if it is outside and we're not there and who's liable and so forth. Yeah.
So those types of issues can still obviously arise within buildings, but in terms of issues about damage and vandalism or inappropriate usage, and at the end of the day, the Act has nothing at all to say about that, but the law would cut people some slack, so to speak. So if something happens and a defib just goes missing, well, as long as the owner is taking reasonable steps to replace it or fix it, they're not going to be penalised.
Right. But it would still be the building owner's responsibility to replace it.
Yeah.
In a reasonable
time frame
and so forth.
Yeah. And I don't know, Charmaine, you might know, I'm not sure whether once these defibs are kind of lifted off their mounting pad or whatever, is there some sort of automated messaging that goes to owners or emergency services or anyone?
Some defibs have a Wi-Fi kind of tracking built in. But I always say to people, get one of those Apple tags or a square and pop that in the bag. That way you can trace it. But as they're kind of developing and bringing out new models, you will see more of that Wi-Fi kind of notification type thing. And that's kind of if it leaves 200 square meters, you'll get a notification. But yeah, because OTRs at the moment, they all have them outside. And there has been a couple that have gone missing. But with the Apple trackers, we've been able to track them down in parks and things like that. Yeah.
Well, I think that, from a legal perspective, as long as the defib that's being installed, perhaps this brings us to what type of defib needs to go in, like what the requirements are. I can only sort of talk to what the Act mentions. It's a defib that complies with the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, or if defibs are not on that register, then something approved by the minister. So I must admit, I don't know whether the Register of Therapeutic Goods has a defib type mandated thing on there.
I think it's more the multi-use. So there are defibs out there that are single use. They're about $700, $800. They haven't been fully tested, so they're not passed by TGA. Whereas there's different models that have been. Everything that we have at St. John's has been tried and tested by us, as well as gone through all of those vigorous tests beforehand. Different defibs have different capabilities. If you have a lot of children, you might want to get a defib that has a child button as opposed to separate child pads and things like that. So it's really best to talk to someone about your business and your situation and what would better suit you.
But what you were saying, Charmaine, and there was a question about this in advance around, obviously there are many different types of defibs, but you're saying the single-use ones haven't been approved by the TGA. So
No,
circling back to what Andrew says, the Act says you wouldn't be complying if you chose a single-use one. You'd have to, yeah.
Some businesses have them, and I guess it's up to Safe Work SA to determine whether they fit for their needs or not. But and also with those single-use ones, there is a lot of fine print as well. Like they can't be over 30 degrees, and you know, there's a lot of different as well.
Not going to work in South Australia.
Yeah, that's it. So we don't personally recommend them for that reason either. Some of the defibs, they might be more expensive initially, but if you look at the upkeep over the years, they might work out cheaper for you as well. And we're always happy to give that advice.
Yeah.
I might just sort of chip in from a legal perspective that this is probably where that distinction that I talked about earlier between the Defib Act that we're talking about now as opposed to WHS requirements. WHS requirements are a bit, they're not, as I understand it, there's nothing mandated in terms of, you know, you've got to have X number of defibs per square meterage of office space or per number of employees. There's nothing like that. And there's also nothing about what type of, if you're going to have a defib, what type you've got to put in. And that's really different to the Act here, which is very specific about the type you've got to put in. So if someone says, oh, you know, I've checked it out and it's legally fine to have a single-use defib for legal purposes, well, that might be true for WHS within your workspace, but it's not true for the purposes of the legislation.
Not for the legislation. With WHS, it's more looking at businesses that or say, sorry if that's loud, say marine when they're offshore and things like that, those type of stipulations. That there's going to be changes in that as well, which will coincide with the legislation that's coming out, obviously, because it's businesses. But with electrical and things like that, sometimes, while it's not a requirement, it's a recommendation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Charmaine, I just wanted to touch base back on, you talked about the app where you register your defib. You said it was called Good Sam?
There is a Good Sam app that's out at the moment, but the government will be launching a registrar where you enter in the details of your defib and the hours that it's accessible.
Okay, that's not yet. That's under development, shall we say?
Sam app is very handy to have now. So.
Okay, great. I was just I'd had a question about if my tour bus travels over Australia, how do I register where my defib is?
Can I?
Oh, that's an interesting one.
That is an interesting one, and that issue happens to be dealt with under the amendments.
Okay.
So the Act fails to distinguish, for the purposes of the register, that I guess it'll be SA Health who administers that register on behalf of the minister. The Act doesn't distinguish between buildings and facilities on the one hand and vehicles on the other. It just says that everybody, whether you're a vehicle or a building, you've got to put all these details in the register. The amendments have recognised that vehicles are all over the place, so the requirement to register the location doesn't apply to vehicles.
Okay.
Well, it won't apply to vehicles once these amendments go through.
Great, thanks for clarifying that question. I'm just conscious of time. If anyone on the call's got any specific questions, please do pop them in the chat or pop your hand up and we can turn to you. But maybe, Charmaine, if we just get you to speak a bit to, you've touched on it, but I think just being explicit about the fact what St John's can do in terms of coming out to individual businesses to help make that decision around what's the right defib and other first aid equipment for your business.
So St John's, we, as a complimentary service to businesses, we have what we call a workplace assessment. So myself or one of my colleagues will come out to your business. We go through everything that you have there as far as first aid, and then we'll talk to you about whether your business will require a defib under this legislation. So it's also the type of business that you do. Is it more adults? Is it more children and things like that? So we can assess what's best for you. Also, obviously with first aid as well, there are requirements there and training requirements as well, so we can address those concerns. But it's a free of charge service, and that's what I do.
That's great. Thanks, Charmaine. And obviously you sell the defibs. St John's sells a range of defibs as well. And
yes, we do. I think there's probably about 12 or 15 that we recommend. As I say, we've tried and tested them all, as well as we work closely, obviously, with everything that's approved by the TGA. If it's not approved, we don't really look at stocking it. We have all first aid equipment through to first aid rooms, through to defibs. And we can send you a comparison sheet as well. If you just flick me an email, if you want to share my details, I can send you a comparison list as well. So you can look at the overall upkeep, how much that might cost you, and what might suit your businesses as
that
well.
would be really helpful, because that's, again, you're preempting my questions again. What's the upfront cost versus what's the ongoing costs?
A defib can start from about 1,600 through to about 3,500, 4,000. Beyond that gets more kind of the ambulances and things like that. So my suggestion would be bank on around 2.5 to 3, maybe 3.5.
As the upfront cost.
At the upfront cost. They don't require electricity or anything like that, so you don't need an electrician to install them. And the battery has a life of about 3 to 4 years. So it will start beeping like a smoke alarm when it's not happy, and the pads have got about the same life as well, and that's the gel on the pads that starts to dry out. So it will just start beeping like a smoke alarm when it's not happy, and you can either give us a call, you can run a diagnostic on it as well, and it will tell you what's wrong.
Yeah, great. But obviously across that portfolio that you guys recommend, there's some nuances in terms of what they do and pricing and so forth. So that comparison would be, super helpful. That would be great.
Yep, sure.
It is worth noting that the Act isn't just a kind of you've got to install a defib and that's that. It's certainly not a set and forget type regime. There are ongoing. The Act sets out ongoing maintenance obligations. You have to test every 12 months. You have to have signage in place advising people where the defib's located. And I imagine Charmaine and St John's would be across all of that and providing all of that as part of their package.
So when people purchase a defib from us, we record the dates, the use by dates of batteries and pads, and we'll send you a little notice to say that that's coming up. But also we offer that kind of tag and testing service, if you like, that we come out, we run an analysis on it, and then we will attach an audit sticker to say that it's been audited by one of us. And much like you have done with like gyms checking electricity and that type of thing, electrical appliances, sorry. And so we have that service, and also if you buy a defib from someone else, you can still jump on that service as well with us. We do a lot of restocking of first aid kits, and so some people add that onto that service as well.
Thanks, Charmaine. Ian has also preempted one of my last questions, which is, do we know if the government is going to provide any financial support to cover this?
At the moment, there is for not-for-profit organisations and clubs, there is a grant available. So that's a $1,000 grant. Unfortunately for businesses, they don't really fall under that. So there is some payment options with different, like our national account, they have Zip Pay and stuff like that. You've got a bit of time. So, you know, we have hotels that have little, they're like an ambulance money box, and people put money in there to buy pads and things like that. But unfortunately, there isn't a lot of help yet, but it does come under the tax. Hang on, I've got it written here. The instant tax.
Write-off?
Yes, that's
Oh,
right.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
so
good
just
to know.
for that, yeah.
Yeah. So you do still have to fork out, but you can
Yeah.
instantly claim it.
That off, yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah, there is, if anyone does happen to be listening from not-for-profit or community organisations, there's on the SA Health website, there's some information about that $1,000 grant process that Charmaine mentioned. Applications, there's a link to the applications for that, which close this Friday.
Oh,
Yep. If you want to flick me an email or jump on St. John's site as well, we've got some links to that. And we're also sending out information and bundle offers and so forth as well.
great. Thanks, Charmaine. We'll put, if you're comfortable, pop both of your details in the follow-up email, and maybe Charmaine, if you could just send through that comparison chart, we could provide that as well.
Yep, absolutely.
To the people who've registered. We are approaching 12 o'clock, so unless any more burning issues come up today, I did want to just highlight for those of you who are TiCSA members, both Wallmans and St. John's have member offers for you. So with Wallmans, you can access a free 15-minute telephone advice line, and they also offer discounted wills and estate planning services for our members. And St. John's, if you're a TiCSA member, you have access to exclusive member offerings, and that's discounts on things like CPR, first aid, mental health, first aid courses, as well as products and like first aid kits and defibrillators. So that information's on our member portal of our website under, I think, services and offers from our members, but we'll pop that in the email as well for you guys, just as a reminder. Is there anything, Charmaine or Andrew, that you wanted to finish up on in terms of any key takeaways? Besides the fact that we'll circle back again once there's more clarity on the legislation?
Yeah, no.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
You go, Charmaine. I was just going to say I don't have anything, I don't think.
I don't have anything to add, but just as I say, you know, have us come out and visit your business. It doesn't cost anything, and that way we can kind of set you at ease of what you might need.
That's great. Hopefully set you at ease, absolutely. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you Charmaine and Andrew for your time and your insights. It's a work in progress, but I think this just helps to keep people, bringing our operators on a journey of knowing what's coming up in the next 18 months for them.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Excellent. Enjoy your lunchtime, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.